Hi, I'm Bill McKibben. I'm a writer and environmentalist and the founder of 350.org. Of all the things that are plaguing us at the moment, the one that has the deepest roots and the most potential danger is the change to the underlying physical stability of the planet. For 10,000 years, the period that scientists call the Holocene and that the rest of us call the kind of period of civilizations, we've had a remarkably stable climate. That's because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been roughly the same, about 275 parts per million. But 200 years ago, we learned to burn coal and gas and oil. And when you burn coal and gas and oil, you put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. And that CO2, by virtue of its molecular structure, traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere has been rising steadily and accelerating. And now we're beginning to see remarkable effects on temperature and everything else. At this point, it's very clear that all the kinds of weather events we're starting to see, including these remarkable array of floods and downpours and deluges, are precisely what the climate models have been predicting will happen. There's no mystery here. This should not come as a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to the data. This is what happens when you add extra energy to the narrow envelope of atmosphere that we inhabit. That energy expresses itself in all kinds of ways. It's why the Arctic is melting. It is why Russia is catching on fire. It is why Pakistan is flooding. It is why we're in trouble. That's what that NASA team meant when they said that go above 350 parts per million CO2 and you're treading in dangerous territory. It's not a problem for the future. It's not something that people's kids will have to deal with or grandkids. It's a crisis breaking over our heads at this moment. We've added about 2 watts per square meter of extra solar power to the Earth's surface. That's a lot, it turns out. So far, we've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree, which doesn't sound like that much. And 20 years ago, when I was writing the first book about all of this for a general audience, I think we wouldn't have thought that it was going to be enough to really make a noticeable difference. But it turns out the planet was very finely balanced, and that 1 degree has caused grievous problem already. Pretty much name a physical system on this Earth, and it's been knocked out of kilter. So, for instance, we're seeing rapid melt of just about everything that's frozen, be it Arctic ice cap or Andean glacier or Himalayan ice sheet. We're seeing remarkable increases in just raw temperature. 2010 saw 19 nations set new all-time temperature records, itself a record, and some of those were pretty amazing. We were speaking with our 350.org friends in Pakistan one day in late May or early June, and one of them remarked that the wet temperature was very hot that day. And I was surprised to hear him say that because, you know, Pakistan's often hot and people don't normally remark on it. But he said, no, really hot. We set the new all-time Asia temperature record today, the hottest it's ever been anywhere in Asia. How hot? 129 degrees, he said. That's hot. That kind of heat causes all sorts of things to happen. Across Russia in the summer of 2010, we saw terrific drought, heat, fire. The temperature topped 100 degrees for the first time in Moscow. Indeed, it topped that 8 different days. By the time it was over, the Kremlin had decided that they weren't going to be exporting any more grain this year and maybe next. That's trouble because Russia's the 3rd biggest grain exporter on the planet. The price of corn and wheat immediately shot up, and there began to be the outbreaks of small-scale food riots in parts of the world where people were having trouble getting dinner. I think there's no question but that there will be expense and economic difficulty in dealing with the problem that we face. We've got to take the most important part of our economy and very swiftly, more swiftly than is economically or politically convenient, transfer it off fossil fuel and onto renewable energy. That can't be done without a certain amount of disruption. On the other hand, it's very clear that not doing it carries far greater economic penalties, far greater. I mean, we're talking about undermining the physical stability that's undergirded all the prosperity that we know. And it's also clear that as we do this work, we'll be providing good jobs that have to be done here close to home. No one is going to put their house on a ship and send it to China to get it insulated or to have solar panels put on it or anything else. The guys who were swinging hammers to build homes that we're no longer building in this country have the skill set necessary to do this kind of work now, to help safeguard us against these worst outcomes. So look, there's no denying that this is going to be a difficult task. Anybody who tells you that it will be simple to just keep the giant machine running, rip out the internal combustion engine and toss in a windmill and go on as before is kidding themselves. On the other hand, since we have no choice if we want a habitable planet, then we better figure out how to do it in ways that maximize its ability to create jobs, create strong communities, maybe build a more democratized and decentralized America than the one we have now. Think about it this way. Just like our banks were too big to fail, so our energy system is too big to fail. If only someone had said 5 or 6 years ago, look, this financial thing is out of control. Yes, we're making a lot of money doing it, just like Exxon's making a lot of money peddling oil. But we're going to have to bite the bullet and deal realistically with this instead of pretending that we're all making money. If we'd done that, we might have stopped things short of the kind of financial collapse that we saw. That financial collapse was bad. It's nothing compared to what is happening ecologically on this planet. That's the too big to fail problem we've really got to address. One of the most powerful results of what we're doing is the effect it's having on the planet's hydrological cycles, the way that water moves around the Earth. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does. The atmosphere of the Earth is 5% moister than it was 40 years ago. That's enough to significantly load the dice so that we get more dramatic deluge and downpour and flood events. And we are seeing them all over. We're seeing them this year in the U.S., in Nashville, in Oklahoma City, in the mountains of Arkansas, along the Texas-Mexico border, in the upper Midwest, in Iowa. Wilmington, North Carolina, in October, had its second 1,000-year storm in 11 years. Abroad, these things are even more devastating because they're falling on places that are even less protected. The center of Monterrey, Mexico's second city, decimated by flooding early in the summer of 2010. Veracruz and Oaxaca followed soon there. Pretty much any place around the world. China, India, Bangladesh, we're seeing incredible flooding because of incredible rainfall. The most remarkable and vivid example was what happened in late July and early August in Pakistan, where rain fell high up in the area of the Khyber Pass, area that normally gets about 3 feet of rain in a year. Parts of it got 12 feet of rain in a week, and the resulting floods were truly amazing. The British set up stream gauges in that part of the world 90 or 100 years ago. The highest water that had ever been recorded on the Kabul River was about 250,000 cubic feet a second in 1929. This storm in the summer of 2010 had 400,000 cubic feet per second flowing down that river before the stream gauges were washed away, as indeed were most of the bridges, roads, and everything else in the path. By the time that flooding was over, a fifth of Pakistan was underwater, and by some estimates, 7 million people left homeless. That's astonishing. The thing to realize about all this, the really scary thing, is not what's happened so far, though if you've been in its path, that's plenty scary enough. What's scary is to realize that that all happened by raising the temperature of the planet 1 degree. The scientists who study this are in pretty clear consensus that we have another degree in the pipeline already from carbon that we've already emitted. That heat is held in the oceans for a little while. There's a kind of thermal lag. More to the point, they're convinced, and there's a robust consensus about this among climatologists, they are convinced that unless we make the switch off fossil fuel, off coal and oil and gas with great speed, that we will see a temperature rise of 5 or 6 degrees in the course of this century. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we better not find out what 4 degrees does. Scientists have done their job. They've done it profoundly well. They've given us a very good idea of what the situation is. In fact, they've given us numbers to work with. They gave us the most important number in the world 2 years ago when Jim Hansen and his team at NASA issued a series of papers saying the most carbon we can safely have in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. Above that, and you can't have, as they put it, a planet similar to the one on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That's strong language from scientists. It's stronger still when you know we're already well past it at about 390 parts per million and rising 2 parts per million per year. We're too high already. We're like the guy who goes to the doctor and the doctor says, look, your cholesterol is too high. You're in the zone where people have had heart attacks. You might have already had a minor stroke yourself. Get it under control. That's what we have to do. The problem is that getting it under control in this case is harder than taking a pill or changing your diet a little bit. It means wholesale changes in how we power our economy. It means taking on the most powerful and profitable industrial enterprise in history, the fossil fuel industry. 8 of the 10 largest companies in the world are in the fossil fuel industry. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money. In our world, this gives them outsized political power, which they've used effectively to delay any real action. As a result, in the 20 years that we've known about climate change, our Congress has an unblemished bipartisan record of accomplishing nothing at all. That's got to change. That's got to change. And the question is how. The impacts of changing the climate are so profound that eventually, and not so distantly, they catch up with everyone. We're already having tremendous flooding across the U.S. But even the things we take for granted, like the fact that we're the breadbasket of the world and can grow immense amounts of food, are open to question in a new way. The studies from Stanford and the University of Washington in the last 2 years have indicated that if temperatures increase, as scientists tell us they will unless we make dramatic moves to get off fossil fuel, that those temperature increases will be enough to cause grain yields to shrink dramatically. Remember that corn and wheat and soybeans evolved to this climate as much as we have, maybe more so because they have roots and can't move around easily. And the estimate is that if we allow the temperature to increase anything like what people are projecting, we'll see grain yields fall by 1/3 or more simply because it'll be too hot for things to grow. That's scary. It's scary in a world where grain is already actually in short supply. The per capita amount of grain grown on this planet has been shrinking for the last 15 years or so. We don't have much margin, and we can't afford this kind of severe disruption that we're looking at now. Nor can we afford for our coastlines. America has an enormously long coastline to be constantly battered by larger storms that come with higher sea levels to begin with and make them scarier. There are now plenty of scenarios about what it will take to put our biggest port cities, New York, Los Angeles, very much in harm's way as sea level rises. Already we see the outbreak of lots and lots and lots of forest fires. Fire season that used to last for a few months in the summer now begins across much of the West in March and continues until the snow falls in the autumn. We've had spectacular outbreaks of mass tree death across millions upon millions of acres across the West because the pine bark beetle, long held in check by cold winter temperatures, no longer is. It doesn't get cold enough to kill it off, and so instead it's killing off just endless. If you get up in an airplane, there are places where you can't see a living tree for many, many, many miles around. Those are the kind of things that are already happening, and that's at a relatively small level of temperature increase. We're literally playing with fire as we go forward. Coal is the greatest enemy we've got. If we take peak oil as a signal to get our act together about fossil fuel, that'll be wise. If we take it as a signal to go burn as much coal as we possibly can, then we're doubly screwed. So this is, the signal we're getting from our oil reserves around the world is a strong signal, sort of like global warming, not quite as strong maybe, but an important signal that we should take seriously the need to transition onto something else. Clearly there are big climatic variations both over time, through ice ages and things, and over latitude. At the moment there are parts of the world that are much hotter than others. That's fine. We're adaptable. We've adapted ourselves to that. That's why we've built our cities where we've built our cities and developed the crops that we've developed and everything else. Now that there are 7 billion of us and an immense amount of fixed investment in place, the adaptation to rapid change is all but impossible. And the change we're talking about is incredibly rapid that's coming with climate change. We're talking in decades, not geological time, So we're going to have to deal very, very, very skillfully to get ahead of this. A lot of the damage, or some of the damage, is already done, and we're going to have to adapt to it. We'll have to figure out how to protect our cities against larger hurricanes and higher sea levels. To a certain degree, we can do that. It'll be expensive and difficult. Past a certain point, we can't do that anymore. The most important part of adaptation at this moment is stopping pouring more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because past a few degrees, there's no reason to think that we'll be successful at all. I mean, you can have the most perfect local food system with, superb organic technique and wonderful soils, and if it rains every day in a row for 30 days, you're out of luck. You're not growing anything. That's the kind of world that we're building, and we better stop quickly. The most important single policy thing that we could do to make all of this go easier, to make transition towns, the biggest change that we could make would be to make fossil fuel pay the price for the damage it does in the environment. At the moment, the oil companies and the coal companies get to use the atmosphere as an open sewer into which to dump for free the waste from their products. That's why they're so profitable and why they'll defend that open sewer so strongly, in Congress and elsewhere. If we were able to attach the price to carbon that it deserves to carry, then many of the changes that we're trying to make would happen much faster. The local food movement which is already growing and growing strongly, but not yet at a point where it really changes the balance of anything in this country. Suddenly, lots of people would be going to the farmer's market not just because the food tasted better and it was healthier, but because the incredible subsidy that we give industrial agriculture would suddenly be apparent in its price tag. And we would realize that it makes more economic sense in any real way to shop for tomatoes close to home, not 5,000 miles away. The same with lots of things. At the moment, everybody trying to do anything good, transition towns or whatever, is swimming upstream against the economic current. We need to figure out how to get the economic winds at our back, the economic force of gravity working in our favor instead of in the direction of 2 cents a kilowatt hour coal-fired power, because that's a very high and hard barrier to overcome. So we always, at 350.org, we always say to people, do 70 or 80% of your work at home, getting your communities ready, doing good things. But save 20% of it to work with us on national and international projects, because if we can get those things done, if we can get a price on carbon, then your life will be easier. And if we can't get it done, then your other work will be for naught. If we really allow the temperature of this planet to warm 5 or 6 degrees, we're not talking about transition towns, we're just talking about trouble towns everywhere. Part of the work that we need to do is get across the urgency of the situation that we're in. One of the ways that we do that in this country sometimes is with mass action and civil disobedience. It's hard to do. It's prone to backfiring and causing trouble, but it's something that needs to be a part of what we do. And we've got some good examples. You know, Tim DeChristopher's work in Utah. Wendell Berry and I sent out a call 2 years ago for the first big mass action on climate change in this country, which was outside the congressional coal plant right off Capitol Hill, a coal-fired power plant that supplies Congress with its power. And we got several thousand people there to surround it and close it down for a little while, and then Congress blinked and said they'd close it down for good. That was a small but significant victory. I mean, one coal-fired power plant down, 600 to go, but a reminder that this is one of the tools we need in our toolbox. I think that if we're going to do civil disobedience and mass action in the time ahead, one of the things we should make sure of is that young people, college students, aren't used as the cannon fodder for this experiment. I think it's far more appropriate for those of us who've spent our lives pouring carbon into the atmosphere to be taking what risks there are with this kind of work. You know, many of the kind of boomer generation started out their lives pretty good, doing lots of useful, idealistic things. Then a lot of them proved to be altogether too good at sort of consumption through their middle years and drove an awful lot of the crisis we see unfolding now. It would be nice if in their latter years they returned to some of that. I guess what I'm saying is, if we're going to sit in around a coal-fired power plant next year, the first day it should only be people who were born in the Eisenhower administration or before, you know, and set the tone for that. And one of the useful things about doing that will be to remind people who the radicals in this story are. They aren't the people trying to shut down coal-fired power in America. The radicals are the people who are willing to double the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and see what happens. That's the most radical idea anyone's ever had. Abbie Hoffman, on his most radical day, never had a thought half as radical as that. We've got to stop that kind of radicalism in its tracks. Well, look, one of the good things that's going on and that people need to realize is that there is a growing recognition and a growing movement. Sometimes it's a little hard to see in America because we're so preoccupied with Tea Partyism or whatever it is that's, you know, dominating the news. But our success at 350.org in mobilizing people around the world has been somewhat notable. Each of the last 2 years, in the fall of 2009 and 2010, we've coordinated these very large-scale global protests. And when I say large-scale, I mean it. In the fall of 2009, we had 5,200 simultaneous rallies in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. Foreign Policy magazine said it was the largest ever coordinated global rally of any kind. In October of 2010, despite the discouragements in Copenhagen and in the US Congress, we passed that size easily. We had what we called a global work party. And on one day in October, there were at about 7,350 sites around the world, people putting up solar panels, digging community gardens, laying out bike paths, otherwise taking part. It happened in 188 nations, i.e. every place on Earth except Equatorial Guinea and North Korea. And it was very remarkable to see. Remarkable in part because of the generosity of people in so many parts of the world who have done nothing to contribute to global warming, who are feeling its effects dramatically, who have every right to be very, very, very angry at those of us in the West who have caused this problem and done nothing to clean it up, and yet are willing to work hand in hand and hopefully along with us to try and deal with this most powerful of all issues. So by now, the information is available. No one has any great excuse for not knowing what we're doing. And the only sort of counter to the science hasn't been more science, it's just been kind of tired ideology. The insistence among people of the right primarily that this can't be true because they wish it not to be true. There's been a great failure, I think, and a very unfortunate one, of conservatives in this country to live up to their creed, live up to the idea that we should try and promote some stability, try and keep things at some level a little bit like the way they were when we came onto this planet. That's a very painful thing to happen. We won't be able to deal with climate change, I think, as long as it remains an ideological football. But that game is being played mostly by the right and very, very hard-nosed at this point. And hopefully that'll change. Even if it does change, there's no guarantee that we have not waited too long to deal with this problem. There are scientists who think that the warming is in many ways irrevocable. The best science indicates we still have a shot, that if we get to work now, we can not stop global warming. We're going to get a couple of degrees at the very least, but limit it, keep it from becoming completely out of control, make this a difficult century, not an impossible one. That's our task at this point, I fear, and it's plenty of task, and it's in some ways great good fun to be a small part of that, to be able to crisscross the world and see just how many people really are laying it on the line to try and protect the one world that we know about.
Please come back and watch complete interviews with each of the experts. And you can join me, Thom Hartmann, anytime on the web at thomhartmann.com.